Okay, so welcome back, and we will start with this our third session. The theme of this session is urban shared spaces. Uh, this session chair is Dr. Ramana Jha sir. Uh, Paper will be presented by Professor Amita Bhide. The first discussant of this session is Dr. Anita Patil Deshmukh, and second discussant is Ms. Mrs. Sulakshana Mahajan. So quickly that I will give you just one-liner introduction of all these people, and then we'll start. So again, that our so Jha sir don't require this the introduction again because he was is the paper presenter of this the first. Yeah, yeah. So no, but you have this the nameplate of Ramana Jha, so you can identify yourself as a Jha sir. Uh, Okay. So today's session paper presenter, Professor Amita Bhide is a professor and dean of a School of Habitat Studies, Center for Environmental Health, Tata Institute of Social Science. Yeah. Then session discussion, Dr. Amita Patil Deshmukh is an executive director and partner of Urban Knowledge Action and Research, that is a PUCA. And Sulakshana Mahajan ma'am is a researcher in urban and women issues with a particular focus in India. Welcome you all, and now I hand over this session to Jha sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Gaikwad. I'm deputing in place of Dr. Kiran Kulkarni, who for certain personal reasons could not make it here. Since we are running late by 10 minutes, without much ado, I would invite Professor Ramita Bhide to make her remarks.
I start with a not publication, but actual PIC association, and for allowing me to present in front of such a august audience. And I sincerely look forward to feedback. This is really a attempt, ideation, I would say. So it takes you completely away from perhaps data, uh, though there is a bit of analytics. And I am also trying to project and think about how could one even think about shared spaces at all. Uh, I'll move into a small presentation, but I'm also going to read from a paper which I had circulated before from time to time. So when we think about shared spaces, there was a very interesting brief given to me while writing this paper. And this was to think about shared spaces from the sheer point of view of functionality. Okay? Um, but I couldn't think of functionality in economic terms at all. And what came to my mind really, and I do believe functionality has economic dimensions to it, but there is a very, there was a very famous planner called Edward Soja, a urbanist from US, and he coined this term called cynicism. And this cyn, I'll go back. So this cynicism is a very very interesting concept, and for Soja, cynicism meant the essence of what is urban or what is a city. And that essentially meant that there would be very interactions and interdependencies in a city, and which then produce some of the most interesting contingencies and coincidences, right? So I think for me, classic stories such as how some of the Sindhi refugees came to cities like Mumbai and Delhi with completely assetless persons, and who have moved to the top or who made their fortunes, to me is classic story of cynicism, because how you meet certain people, how you get relationships going, how people meeting each other, forming associations, all of these really are demonstrations of cynicism, and therefore functionalities in multiple ways. And the lack, or perhaps we I think Jhasar talk about rare action and rare direction in which we were moving in relation to urban governance. But I think for me, the pandemic was one such moment. And I'm going to specifically talk about Mumbai here with a very small example. I won't get into too many details of this case. We all know that the COVID pandemic and the kind of strategy which was deployed by the Maharashtra government required different kinds of treatment centers. So you had very specialized hospitals at the top, and at the ground level, there were these quarantine centers, triple C 1 centers and triple C 2 centers. Uh, Now, how does one, given the kind of portion of infection which was projected, how does one commandeer such a lot of spaces within the city which are capable of being triple C1 and triple C2 centers? And this really proved a challenge for many, many cities, definitely for Mumbai, in two ways. Number one, कि the spaces which could fit the infrastructural requirements which were needed even for preliminary COVID treatment, there were very few such spaces that the city could actually muster. And therefore, reaching the targets, required targets, always was a challenge throughout the two big episodes of the pandemic that the city experienced. The second was the challenge of the spatial distribution of these kinds of amenities. So the very city which talks about a model like Dharavi, which it could achieve basically because the presence of extremely well distributed public amenities completely fell short when it came to a ward like East, which is a peripheral ward of the city. And in this particular ward, the spaces which were commandeered for triple C1 and triple C2 centers were actually resettlement colonies, which themselves were located in high pollution areas. They were designed as uh, very, very low quality and high density buildings, poor ventilations. So you can understand the kind of challenge that I'm talking about. So it is COVID care center. Simple. Uh, So one was meant for all those who are at risk, who are positive, who are not suffering a whole lot, but who require some amount of monitoring and care. The other are for people who are the high risk contacts of these people. Okay? Yeah. Okay. So I think this kind of crisis, and I am using this as an example because when we think about a urban future, which definitely perhaps poses and increases the signals are all that we may face more and more of such kind of risks into the future, and we should therefore be prepared for more such disasters. And what COVID pandemic does is actually shows us what are the weaknesses, what are the fundamental gaps just within this particular thing of shared spaces. I'm not focusing on any other aspects of the pandemic and the pandemic response at all. Okay, just to focus on this topic of shared space. Now, given this inadequacy of the shared spaces, let us now go into this is a map which actually shows uh, how spatially the COVID relief structures, different kind of COVID relief structures, including nutritional structures, etc., were distributed throughout the city. And you can clearly see ki on the uh, northeast corner is the East ward, where 77% of the population stays in slums or slum-like settlements, and you can look at the size of the ball, which actually looks at the represents the number of such amenities, which is a poor representer perhaps of the quality, etc. Not getting into that, but of all COVID relief structures in the city. Just making my point again. Uh, so beyond these crises then, what is really the importance of shared spaces? So one is, we talked about synergism right at the beginning. There is also the sheer functionality of a city. And when I say functionality here, I want to move away from the idea of interdependence to even say that all of us can't just live in privatized, individualized spaces. that a city requires, and the very concept of a city requires layers of different kinds of publicness. And from that point of view, we need to think about functionality. In Indian cities, the importance of public spaces and shared spaces is even more. So there are studies of older cities like Ahmedabad which show us how layered public spaces in older parts of the cities were. Okay? Because you move beyond the house to extend with a extended neighborhood, then a larger community, then a still larger community, then space for commuting and transport, to then layers of privateness. So one is really talking of different kinds of neighborhoods and kinds of codes which exist in order to inhabit these kind of shared spaces. So there would be spaces which women can command, there can be spaces which children can command, there can be spaces which senior citizens just come together and share parts of their day. And this is therefore extremely critical, I would say, because in Indian cities, our lives are led much more outside the home than within the home. And this is perhaps something which is very critical to understand. Small homes are possible if there are larger public spaces that you can exhibit. That is in some ways also what the slum as a habitat teaches us. That you can have lesser space within the home. But if that is accompanied by a larger space outside which you can command, I think that is something which is very much acceptable in terms of life. And finally, the value of shared spaces is also in terms of the resilience for cities, in terms of inclusion and cities becoming more inclusive, because then they can give many more affordances to different sections of the people who may not really be fully acknowledged within the overall realms of citizenship, of especially property citizenship. And shared spaces are also in some ways required, because from point of view of the future, we should talk about resource frugality, especially in terms of land, and therefore, again, shared space. So I come and try to develop really, and a lot of the paper is first talking about the developing a perspective on shared spaces. And I come at it from three kind of perspectives. Or rather, two of these are the most common and most important. First is this term called commons, which is becoming increasingly important to the context of the global south. And I want to just put two quotes in this regard. One is the work of a person called Stavrides. And Stavrides basically argues that in the context of global south, one should basically look at the entire city as commons. Okay? Now, this is a very, very important argument, because conventionally one can see, or especially in the modern cities, have always been developed, regulated, governed on the principle of private property. In more recent times, this has even more been accompanied by optimal land to those who can pay the optimal value. And from this point of view, when we think about the city as a commons, it raises multiple questions and challenges for us. But it is crucial. Why is it crucial? It is crucial because we are still talking of a day and age where we are not settled in our urbanization process. There are many more people who are aspirant of coming to cities and finding a future there. And do our cities have the capacity? Should they become exclusionary cities which should part and give benefits to only those who are inhabiting the city, that too who have managed to occupy properties? I will not get into questions of law, legitimacy here, because they are highly contested in our context. No? Who came to be owners of particular lands and how? And what is the legitimacy of this, right? Not law, not legality of this, the legitimacy of these occupations. and whether people who will come to the city in the future, do they have any stake in the city? Does the city offer any scope for them? Does the city offer any possibilities of meaningful livelihoods for them? And meaningful lives for them, healthy lives for them. And from that point of view, the commons perspective is a very, very important perspective. Of course, one will need to adapt that perspective. For example, when it comes to nature commons or ecological commons, one of the principles of commons says that no one can be excluded from commons. Okay? Commons are those that are open to all, right? On the other hand, when we adapt concept of commons to cities, we may need to think of boundaries that are porous boundaries perhaps and layered boundaries. But having commons as a perspective which can coexist with the principle of private property and property governance perhaps is as important to the future of our cities as perhaps looking at optimal land values, etc. How does one create that space where commons can coexist? And for this, commoning practices are important because no commons can remain vital unless there are commoning practices. For example, streets of Mumbai are occupied by Govindas or Ganesh Mandals for a particular period of time. So commons takes you to a perspective where nobody necessarily has a permanent right to that property. One needs to think of negotiated temporalities, things, claims which are limited in time and space. So the same space can be shared by multiple groups at particular points in time, maybe through the day and maybe also through different seasons and months. So I think commons and commoning offers us very, very interesting and very different perspectives of looking at the city itself. Second category, public spaces. And public spaces has been a very juridical category introduced by the law. And to me, it represents a very important concept. But at the same time, it is also something which, because it has been backed up by plans, because it has been backed up by laws, because it is something which is also internationally practiced, it presents several challenges in our context. And I'll illustrate some of these challenges as we go further. One of these is to think about what exactly is the definition of a public space. Does public refer to a space which is managed by a public institution? Or does public refer to something which is used and is available to a general public? Because in Indian cities today, we see actually that both these things are being flipped. For example, management of spaces is increasingly being given to private actors with maybe a mandate to act for the public, but it represents a huge appropriation of spaces as well. An example here can be the huge controversy in Mumbai over the adoption of public parks or caretaking public parks. Okay? So who does this, on what terms, and then does it remain public anymore? Public space, public park, can it accommodate and give free entry to people who look like ruffians, who are not very well dressed, whose mannerisms are different? And is this the public which can be allowed? Or our thinking of public space is increasingly being sanitized and therefore also curtailed. So this is one kind of contestation around public spaces. Second kind of contestation is the norms for public spaces and definitions as well. So here in the definition, for example, the UN definition talks of public space as a different category from open spaces. In many of the URDPFI guidelines, they talk of both of these as one category. Public space is equal to open space. There are still others which go very, very strictly and say that open space means anything that comprises a space which is unconstructed or does not have any built structure over it. Okay. Further, there are also additions like, does ecological commons, do spaces like beaches, waterfronts, riverfronts, lakesides, do they fall under public spaces, open spaces, none of these ecological spaces? How does one understand each of these? And then comes the issue of norms. How much public space, how much open space should there be per person? And in Indian cities, again, this has been a matter of huge contestation. So if we think of the URDPFI guidelines, they themselves short of international norms. Then you start looking at the status within Indian cities, then you will start realizing that only perhaps cities like Delhi and Bangalore are able to come a little bit closer to these international norms. And then in cities like Mumbai or other dense cities, we will say that these are unfeasible, these are unrealistic norms. So then how does one define norms? Because the purpose of norms is to move us to something which is higher, right? Not looking at only something which is feasible, right? So public, the entire notion of public spaces very much brings us to these kind of questions. I'll illustrate some of the conventional mechanisms which have been used to conserve public spaces through a very small and a very interesting case. At least I felt it was very interesting. This is the case of Badrana Johad in a small town called Nawalgarh, which is located in the Shekhawati region of Rajasthan. And these are the headlines which really struck me. And this is the Johad. So what you can see is this piece of open land in a very, very small town whose 2012 development plan basically declares this as a open vegetation area. Now this is an entire area of about 225 bighas, which was used, belonged to the erstwhile princely Shekhawats, the princes of the region, but who gave it and offered it as a commons and therefore transferred it to a trust. This space is used for a cattle fair, annual cattle fair in the region, one of the very large ones in this entire Shekhawati region. It is also used by passers-by and migrants as temporary households, very temporary ones. And there is a stepwell, Johad, as you know, very popularly known in Rajasthan. As I said, in 2012, the status of this land in the plan of the city was open vegetation area. Come COVID, there are 2-3 things which have happened. Number one, the municipal council of this town, Nawalgarh, declared that this would 60% of this land would be used as a commercial area. And this is a resolution which got passed in the municipal council. The corporator of this particular area, who also happens to be a trustee of this trust to whom the land was awarded, says that no, this land is not going to be used for commercial purpose. We are going to build a very big charitable hospital here. Okay? In the meantime, a lot of the villagers and some of the activists over there, you saw the initial headlines, they had a 90-day dharna over the spot. They went to court. The court said nothing doing, this is an open vegetation area, the status needs to be maintained. But in the meantime, as you can see, the corporation had already cut down several of the khejri trees which were present on the plot. They have also started building a road which passes through the area. The overall area of the stepwell has also been altered. So this is the argument. Why am I talking about Najafgarh? Basically because it's a very, very small town. We often think of all of these vested interests, real estate dynamics as happening only in larger cities like Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, Bangalore, etc. But I think it is very important to recognize that the penetration of these forces is very, very deep and they happen in multiple places. And not just that, but what this basically tells us, and the basic question that I can really we need to ask is, can planning secure shared spaces? And this is the question against which I would like to understand this case. On one hand, this case is telling us that planning has really been ineffective in terms of protecting this space. It is very, very vulnerable to the power structures in the city, which can manipulate the plan and which can then create the changes in the rules and which can actually execute this to not very common interests. On the other hand, it also tells us what planning can do. Because there was a development plan, the activists and the local people could go to court. Uh, because this plan was in the public domain, they had something to fight over. Uh, and which is what I think illustrates us that if planning has to be the mechanism by which shared spaces have to be secured, then there are two things that are very, very necessary for planning. Number one, planning has to be communicative, which often our plans aren't. So, planning has to really take this task of communicativeness uh, within the way it is written, within the way it is represented. And the second task that I would suggest is perhaps also needs to be very much transparent and very much in the public domain, not just available as a public document, because only then one can create shared states and perhaps talk about a protection of a few open spaces. Um, there are other, we already talked about planning, and we talked about the contestations linked to planning as a mechanism to ensure spare spaces as well. So I will not speak about this slide. Uh, and this is also something that we have spoken about. The more contemporary approaches which are being now experimented with throughout the world are those approaches which are based on design. So, design is based on detailed micro studies. Design contains and comprises possibilities of reconciling multiple aspects of placemaking, and which here in this case refer to shared spaces. Designs are also can be potentially accommodative of temporal and spatial flexibility. And perhaps if they incorporate the principle of not privileging any single use, okay, they can also bring on multiple stakeholders on board. For example, in this very city of Pune, the smart city Pune experimented with common streets, right? And where the car did not remain the monopoly user of a street anymore, but the street space had to be shared with pedestrians, with people who were disabled, with children who also wanted to loiter and play around. Okay, so there are multiple uses then that the street gets imbued with, besides only privileging the right of movement, which has been the conventional way of planning. Uh, uh, Finally, I would talk about the interface between policy, governance, and nudging. Because what shared spaces talks about and requires really is governance at a slightly different level, which is the micro level governance, which has completely been ignored, neglected in our cities. Like I always talk about a particular road in my locality, which has four different surfaces in a 25-meter road. So there are paver blocks, then there is the usual dumper, then there is a part of it which is concretized, and there is a fourth part of it which is just kacha. So all of these four can coexist on a single street. And to me, this what it represents really is a lack of coordination or of planning, execution at that micro level. This is not talking of strategic planning or land use planning or so on and so forth. But there are no authorities who will coordinate at that level of the locality, of the neighborhood at all. You also require governance mechanisms which are able to maintain the balance between active use, appropriation, be wary of appropriation and privatization, and constantly think about more flexible, participative, dynamic processes which can also be partnering of multiple stakeholders. And that is what can bring creativity to particular spaces. Otherwise, shared spaces can be created by a plan, but otherwise they can be appropriated. They are very, very vulnerable to be appropriated by others. So, finally, to conclude, I think there is no doubt that shared spaces are an imperative. For all the reasons that we talked about previously, shared spaces are necessary. But I think to think about shared spaces, one really needs to think about shared spaces from a reimagination of a city as a valuable resource to be shared by those who are currently in it and to be shared with those who are yet coming. And therefore, we have to really play a very balanced role, and it talks of different mechanisms to do this, which cannot be done only through planning. We need to go beyond planning, think about a level of policy, governance, and programming, which is really at a different level, which is much closer to people.
Hello, good afternoon. Uh, I'm going to answer some of the questions and share some of the insights raised by Amita. The second part of her paper was, can planning secure shared spaces? As a planner, I want to answer, if we have to continue with the present framework of planning, we can't plan anything for shared spaces. And I will answer why we can't. But first of all, before taking this shared spaces as a category, I want to say I'm very happy that the debate of this subject of spaces is away from public and private spaces. I, if I look at the history of public and private properties in Mumbai, private property was never there as part of Mumbai or any of the cities or any of the villages, because most of the land was owned and controlled by the rulers, and they used to distribute land as and when, or redistribute lands as and when required. And private properties were created by consciously to create a capitalist market of land in 1834, and subsequent surveys and land records created by British to, to support the growth of cities. And that's why I never liked this public and private binary. And my real experience, or many of planners' real experience, is that we never had this binary. Most of us, we shared spaces across time or space, like in Chawls. BDD Chawls, the rooms are very small, but the middle passage is very broad. And that 10 feet passage is used as living space, as play space, as women to gather together, exchange views, exchange gossip, exchange news. That is a very valuable space, and that is today is trying to be encroached by, not by private sector, but the public authorities. Second, the gardens and the open spaces created in the middle of these public housing of BDD chawls is now completely proposed to be wiped out. Actually, the rooms were very small, but this BDD chawls actually created number of sportsmen because they had large playgrounds, they had schools had playgrounds, and that playground and gardens and open spaces were used for multiple factors like Amita described. So most of us grew up in chawls or wadis or wadas where there were men chowks and the chowks were washing places, play spaces, women to gather. There were passages to approach houses. There were passages to create a vibrant culture there and used as spaces for marriages or any other function. So we have, as a planner, I always had serious doubts about present planning framework. And thanks to Amita, her paper again made me think about it. So we clearly see the Indian experience and the norms that have been created by the planning framework. They don't match culturally, socially, or in reality as well, because we keep on sharing spaces even today. No one really objects when streets are used for Govindas in Mumbai. Of course, everyone suffers for a day or half a day, but everyone is ready to accept it. But they want to control the noise. They want to control the dust. Few things they have to be controlled. So, why present planning cannot secure shared spaces? I'm going to put my thoughts into it. Shared spaces as an important resource depends on the social structures and norms and culture. For example, Indian cities were always divided by the occupations or caste, and each caste had a street or whatever function. So it was at a time divided, at the same time its communities could gather and share. There was trust among people because they were community controlled and some of the common interests, but there were no commons except the grazing grounds or some others. Even temples or praying places were different. In Chennai, Iyengars and Ayyars, they have two temples, but they face back to back, but they don't approach from the same street. They approach from different streets. So this is the space in a way is shared, but at the same time is differentiated. So it's very funny in Indian culture and in society. Second aspect why we can't secure shared spaces, because shared spaces are impeded by legal provisions, MRTP Act, codes, rules, etc. So we can't say that this is a shared space for these many activities. If school is school, you cannot say that this school could be converted or a ground could be converted into a mela for 2 days. Then the school is not operating. That is not possible because of the rules. Political and economic interests also impede such sharing. Or at the same time, they also facilitate when it's necessary. Then control over planning and implementation is actually removed from the communities and local people. So that is impeding the sharing of spaces. Sharing of spaces is also about caring. And caring for people, their lives, their well-being, their health. And that is also missing from our planning norms. As of today, when we were studying the BDD chawl redevelopment, this caring factor and sharing factor is totally thrown out of the windows. And if you don't care about livelihoods of the people, the health of the people, then the kind of public projects that are created, they become anti-people. So sharing and caring go hand in hand. How much you can care, for whom you are care. You care for cars or you care for people. That is a big problem. They want to create parking spaces, by taking away parks for the children. That is what I mean, is not caring for the people, but caring for the cars, and that is private cars. Caring about ecology is also part of sharing. Environmental sharing also is to be there. So thinking beyond here and now has to be there in the planning. And so if planning is to secure shared spaces, we have to change the present planning ecosystem. And we have to study our own cultural, social practices and try to change the given model of planning or town planning of only the systems of statistical open spaces and all that, and try to figure out ways to apply them in our society and in our culture. So we have to stop preparing rigid master plans as products, and we have to, which are prepared only for 20 years. No one looks at them. Nothing is implemented, hardly 5 or 10%. So planning is about the process of securing or changing or making transformation about something which is impeded by the present planning practice. So we have to concentrate on reforming the process of planning, which needs to be continuous. The city is constantly changing. Society is changing. Dynamism has to be built into the process of planning. It has to be informed by the real needs of the people and not by the norms and aspirations of some class of people. And I think the residents and communities should take charge of the shared spaces and decide what is to be done with the spaces, whether they are open spaces or closed spaces like mandals or social halls. Even in our BT station, sometimes a dancer group comes up and starts using it, and people enjoy it. No one stops it because there is no law which can stop it, and it is for 10-15 minutes, but it becomes an entertainment space. It becomes a space where knowledge is exchanged, information is exchanged, and that's a good thing. I mean, we have to think of such informal, spontaneous actions people take and try to figure out how we can support them, how we can incorporate them, and the control should be from centralized planning unit to the local and community level. How much we can transfer, what should be transferred, that should be thought of. Thank you.
For answering of the questions that were raised by Dr. Bedi, her own insights into the subject. Now I move on to invite Dr. Anita Patil Deshmukh to make her observations.
So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Gadgil for inviting me to such an august gathering. I also must confess that I find myself totally misfit in this august gathering of scholars and academicians and urban planners and architects and bureaucrats and journalists like my dear friend Kumar, because individually and collectively you have such a great amount of expertise and experiences and wisdom about urbanization processes. So I'm really not sure what I'm going to share with you. I think what I'm going to share with you is what I've learned through Amita's paper, what has resonated with me deeply from that paper, and also share with you the idea of shared spaces from the perspective of those people who are invisible in this city, whose voices are usually not heard very comfortably, and on whose shoulders all the cities in India run. So I come to this place from their perspective. On the other hand, I must share with you that Amita has been a resource person for Apokar's flagship program called Youth Fellowship for last more than 11-12 years. And every year she will come and train our marginalized youth about doing research on their own communities and how they can create shared spaces in their own communities, do research about community problems, find local solutions and implement them to get their communities to a little better shape, because they really don't have much of a power, neither do they have resources. But I'm amazed, and Amita will prove to that even people with very little resources, what they can do with their imagination and their creativity. And that's the beauty of working with those youth fellows. So what did I like about this paper? I learned a new term called synechism. So thank you, Amita. That was good. I also like Gidwani and Aviskar's concept of spaces, which includes not a physical space, but also activities like, waste pickers and rivers and washer people and street that enable work for several groups of people. To think of space not just as a physical or geographical space, but to think of it as a space where a lot of activities, collective activities take place, a space where capital is, their labor is used either for capital production or labor is used for the community production. I think that concept of Aviskar was really very, very good. It really, I really liked and learned that. And also the fact that these are collective practices in these shared spaces. So, and I was thinking about all the hawkers and the women who sell vegetables and fish on the side of the road. So on the same road, multiple activities go on all the time, at least in the places where I work with, in Dharavi and in Kolabandar. Road is not only for mobility. Road is for multiple things. Children are playing cricket there, vans are moving, bicycles are going around, people are selling things, people are dancing, singing. So that is, at least in poorer neighborhoods, that is they actually exhibit the true sense of shared spaces. As Sulakshana said, it is also about sharing your joys, your sorrows, sharing your problems and trying to help each other. So in that sense, a shared space is a much larger, it occupies a large area of actually your life for poor people. I mean, in Kolabandar, I often see, I go there very, very often, so often see women joining together and doing some work together. Also in shared spaces, at least in the poorer communities, the concept of Dukan Makan exists in a very large percentage. We have large percentage of homes in Kolabandar and also in Dharavi where there is a business or some sort of an entrepreneurial activity going on. And they live there. And this is an area where I think the planning actually has to look at this activity a little differently, in the sense that some sort of a space needs to be made available to poor people where they can actually conduct their entrepreneurial activity without having to worry about ki are abba police aayega and then all this will be gone and then I will have to give him a bribe to bring all of this back. I mean, we did a huge amount of research on Chembur's street, Hawker Street, and this was the usual story. There will be hawkers on both sides of the road, and they are very useful to people, especially middle class people who do a lot of their purchasing with the hawkers. So it's not that just hawkers are useful only for poor people. A lot of middle class people, and we interviewed quite many of them, so this is a part of our research. What would normally happen is the BMC van will come, they have to just pack everything and hide somewhere or give the bribe to the BMC guys and then they come back to the street. So this kind of activities need to be looked at by the governance people, so that people don't have to be so scared for their life and their wear whatever they're wearing. So that's a kind of shared space where governance has to, or the local municipalities or BMCs need to look at how they can manage these spaces little better for poor people. The other area I wanted to ask about is, when we did a 6 years long research on mills and trolls in Girangao, the mill area in the center of the city. Now, when mill workers used to go to the mill, there was a lot of area around the mills which was actually occupied by mill workers for multiple things. Now, a lot of those areas are now become very fine, very exclusive high-rise buildings, and they have become gated communities. So what was once upon a time a public space is gone. Now it has become private space where nobody can enter unless you have some pass or some identification or something like that. So that's something that bothers me a lot, that you have actually taken city space which belonged to everybody and made it into a private space. I also look at things like Bombay Club, Bombay Gym, and Wellington Club. They were basically municipality. I mean, those spaces, huge and beautiful spaces, belonging to the BMC or whosoever the governing body was then. Now they have become exclusive clubs where nobody can enter unless you can pay crore of rupees for a membership. So these are the things which really, makes me think that how can spaces which should belong to everybody are just becoming more and more and more exclusively owned by people who can only afford it. So this is one on the one hand. On the other hand, when I look at the promenades, Bandra Promenade or Chowpatty or the Marine Drive, where you see poor people, rich people, everybody walking together. And those are the real places of equalizers. There your dressing and your income and your class and caste and religion really doesn't count. Those are the true shared spaces, and I think we, in any city, and I can't talk about any other city. The other thing which I have liked very much about shared spaces is at least in Bandra, we have a street which every other Sunday or every third Sunday is closed to all the vehicles, and then people can have their exhibitions, stalls, whatever, but no motor vehicles are allowed. I think this is a very common practice in many Western cities. I have lived in a Western city for a long time, so I can share about that with confidence. So, also in Delhi, I think the street in front of Red Fort has now all been converted into a huge share space where people can actually, no cars are allowed again, and people can really do anything and everything, including festivals and stuff like that. So those are the kind of spaces that need to be created when urban planners are looking at planning, and in that planning processes, I think the poor people need to have a space at the table for discussions. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Patil Deshmukh, for very insightful views on how you look at shared spaces and what can be done to protect them. We have a very small window for questions, so if there are one or two, yes, Scott.
In the various redevelopment brownfield projects that are coming up, starting with maybe slum redevelopment, and then thereafter now we have this massive Dharavi redevelopment, BDT Chawl. The narrative that is getting built and which is also being peddled by the political leadership and even maybe the bureaucrats, telling people that no, earlier you used to get 160, if you are getting 180 you should be happy, then 180 goes to 225 to 269 to 300, and now there is competitive politics of 400 in Dharavi, 500 in BDT. that this is being told to the people, and that is taking away the shared space that was available, and we are luring them into accepting a larger space, private space for them in their homes. So this narrative, I think there is need for us to build this narrative, because when you and Sirish Patel told me that let's go and talk to the people of BDT Chawl and Raju Wagmare and company, but then Raju Wagmare also, if he goes and tells the people, no, why don't you understand that this 160 was fine, but there were a lot of shared spaces that is being taken away while you are being offered a 500 square feet. That is not very convincing to the people. So people will not come forward to say, no, stop this redevelopment, because this is going to be massively taking away all our shared space. So I think there is a need to build that narrative also, where we convince the people that in this whole process, you are being cheated, or you are being lured into getting a larger home for yourself, but then the other community space where you used to do a whole lot of activities will be going away from you.
Yeah. Thank you for raising this BDD Chawl issue. Actually, what we are suggesting is not to reduce private space of 500 square feet. What we are offering as an alternative, me and Shirish Patel, is that okay, if you want 500, you will get 500. But don't share it, the whole plot, with sales component, which will add few more thousand residents, increasing the density and reducing the open spaces, the garden spaces, the side open spaces, and affect your health and well-being. And then you will be in 40-story building, and it will be expensive. And don't do this. So we are not saying that you will not get 500. We are saying you will get 500. You will retain your whole plot for yourself. You will get it free, because the government has promised it. What we are saying is lower 3 floors of the building will be commercial, where there will be dispensaries, even the schools, and then we have created additional grounds for the community and people, and not only for BDD, but for the ward and city as well. I will share you what we have.
No, you are getting me wrong. I am not saying what you're doing is not enough there. There you of course saying that the sale component will come down or whatever. I am saying that gradually in this whole process of offering them a larger space free of cost, we are marginalizing them and we are taking away their shared spaces. That narrative is not being built. That's the point I am making.
That has been done with the legal provisions. That is especially.
So I just want to comment on your comment there. So we did interviews of people who left slums and went into SRA buildings. While they were happy that they had the facilities like toilet and water, they were extremely unhappy that they had lost all their community relationships and community spaces, and they all wanted to go back to slums. Where he said, oh, if I have to go to the work, I can leave my kid with my neighbor. Here, I can't do that. I mean, those are real issues that people are facing in these new problems, new facilities.
So, three very short questions. Not questions, like part questions, and mostly for Amita. One is that what's the mechanics of reimagining this? Because we have faith in persuading action on climate. It's also talking about the shared global common. Like there's an atmospheric common, and we have plundered it. So there we are trying markets. We are creating a counterpoint here. So is there a lesson for that? And so that's point one. Second is that how should we, like, I have lived in Bombay for many years, and I have seen a palpable mistrust because of class difference. And so except for spaces what Anita talked about, like Bandstand or Marine Drive, etc. Wherever there's always this element of mistrust. And that brings me to this question, this point that Sulakshana ma'am was making about social structures. It all boils down to how we are organizing ourselves as a society. And finally, is there some pathway to where we share everything, like share responsibilities, like completely reorder the way we live our lives? Is that a possibility? COVID has really pushed us to think on those lines.
I don't dare to answer them, okay, but I will venture to respond to them. So on the mechanics of achieving this, my only thought is a global commons is a abstract idea. But I think shared spaces are very much lived experiences. People want them. Okay? People have stakes in them. And to me, that is the way to build them up. Okay? And how does one use these as scaffolds to perhaps also move upward? I mean, that is the only thing that I can perhaps suggest. The second, in terms of mistrust, the social structures, I completely agree that this is something which can prevent social interaction. But I will also give you a contrary experience of a city like Mumbai as just an illustrative city. I have lived all my life in Mumbai and I love this city like crazy. Okay? But one of the most moving examples and life experiences for me was in the 1984, there were police riots. And I was caught. I was a college-going girl at that time, and I was caught in the riots. Our bus tires were inflated somewhere near Varli. I used to stay in Sion. Okay, I didn't know the geography. I didn't know the way home. Okay, I was helped to reach home by so many kinds of people who I have never seen, who definitely I have never met in my future life, okay, but people were willing to help. And this is what is the spirit of cities, I would say, this extending a hand. So there is a mistrust, okay, there are differences in interactions, but there is also a reach out, okay, and I think cynicism is actually about that. No, it is not obliterating all social differences. It doesn't do that. Okay, people will still be maintaining their forts in some ways, but they are also willing to come out of this. And the third, in terms of complete reordering, I'm not entirely sure about this complete reordering. In fact, I also feel that there has to be also a shake-up of compulsory coming together. For example, Maharashtra government has this extremely stupid idea of organizing all scales of residents into a cooperative society, which is horrible. In all our slum redevelopment societies, we have 120, 150 tenements. We are forming a cooperative society of all of them together. In redevelopments which are in situ, you will have ex-slum dwellers staying on the bottom 5 or 6 floors. Then there are middle class residents who have bought tenements on the top floors, and we bind all of them into one cooperative society. Now these are what compulsory togetherness and working together, which I think should not be there. I think that's why I said, and these are therefore not matters of larger policy. I think at times we are doing too much policing also and policing also, and there are things that we don't order. The right scale of structures has to be somewhere at the closer to the neighborhood level. Right?
This was a fascinating discussion, something different from the first 2 sessions that we had. A completely different aspect of city, which generally we forget to talk about, but which is vital for citizenship in a city. I think from that point of view, shared spaces are vitally important, critically important, but as you could have made out from the speeches that our experts gave here, shared spaces are in danger. And there are different kinds of forces that are acting against the continuation of shared spaces. And there are fights going on between citizens and the authorities in regard to these kinds of spaces all over the country. That is where we again go back to basic governance principles, that unless we adequately get the citizens into the framework of governance, it will always be difficult to do the kinds of things that we want to do. Thank you for your brilliant exposition, and this was a lovely session. We have run out of time, so I'll stop and pass over to the next session.